I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to acknowledge the committee and the community members that are here. Tansei, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 land and that treaty was signed in 1876. As Terry mentioned, my name is Sharon Morin and I'm the third youngest daughter of the retired Senator Thelma Shalafu. She was the first Métis woman and the first Aboriginal woman ever appointed to the Senate of Canada, and I'm honored to be here and sharing with you tonight. So I just want to give you a little background about myself, and it's kind of a traditional way where when we introduce ourselves, we talk about who we are, where we're from, and a little bit about what we know. I've been fortunate to be raised in a very traditional, what I say traditional, but sometimes unconventional Métis way. I was raised by a single mother, and she worked all the time. She never stayed at home. She was always working. So when she worked, we usually went to work with her. That was one of the ways that we were learning. So and when I mean work, I mean out into the community. Wasn't so much in an office. It was more about being in the community, participating in annual Métis events and assemblies and all sorts of community endeavors and meetings. I was exposed to many people during this time. Elders, community developers, local and high-level politicians, people in the media, and the likes. I'll just share one thing with you. The most highest ranking person I ever met with my mother was the Queen of England. And that was kind of like the top of the cake for me and for her. And every time we went out and every time we sat in these meetings, I was learning. I was one that liked to sit with the elders. I was one that liked to listen. And sitting there and listening is partly what I'll share with you tonight. But I'm also going to share with you my university education, and that's the University of Thelma. And these are the stories as I know them. So who are the Métis? I got to remember to use the PowerPoint. Who are the Métis? The Métis, I say, are a Canadian-made brand. There are others around the world that are mixed due to colonialism, but in Canada, we are recognized as being Indigenous peoples. We are a mixture of both First Nations and European. And although we could, and through all of that, we consider our blood pure. I'm not half or a quarter of anything. I am 100% Métis. We have to prove our ancestry. In order to have the status, if we want to have the political card through one of the political organizations, we have to prove our ancestry, and we do that through our genealogy and following the Métis script trail. And you have to go back at least 5 generations to prove that. We are fortunate in our family to have a genealogy that follows our Métis and European ancestors all the way back to 856 AD in France with Robert the Strong. And that was due to the oldest niece in the family. And she took that challenge on, and it took her 3 years to do it. But it's a big binder, and it was one of the biggest gifts that we ever got as a family from her or anybody. I believe that everyone should know who they are and where they come from. It makes for a strong person, I believe. I was never brown enough, and I was never white enough. So having that knowledge of who I was and where I came from gave me the power as I grew up to not let that bother me. But as a young person, it did. Mom always said that we were the Rainbow Nation and that we come in many colors and many shades. And I see that within my siblings, from dark to light, and I'm one of the lighter ones. The Métis are recognized as one of the 3 Aboriginal peoples in Canada in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. And it took a lot to gain that recognition. With so many voices at the table that needed to be heard, the Métis needed to get their message across and to share who they were as a people. And the way they did that was through prayer. The Métis were given an opportunity to say prayer during the consultations. And in true Métis tradition and true Métis spirit, they had their Catholic priest with them. And that priest happened to be Father Guy Lavallee. He sat up all night with other people that were in the delegation and wrote a 20-minute prayer. And it kind of explains who we were and who we still are today. The Métis have been in this area since the very beginning of the fur trade. My talk will focus on the general region of Amiskwachee, Waskagan, as it was part of a whole region that was treated as such by the First Nations, Métis, and fur companies. When the fur trade was at its peak, the fort did not encourage families. The fort was a place of business. This conflicted with Métis tradition. So the Métis had their families settled in other areas around the city, or around the region. Lac St. Anne and St. Albert regions. And I mention those because those were Catholic missions in the area, and they were important to the Métis of the time. And still today, there are still a lot of Métis people that are Catholic. Those Métis played a vital role in Edmonton and supplied the meat, the fish, the pemmican, and labor on a regular basis. Plus, many of them worked for the HBC. The HBC also had a horse guard, and that horse guard was out by Big Lake. And that was the original site of the Métis settlement known as Mistahai Sagigigan. They hid the horses in the trees that surrounded the whole area. We have found in the journals, we've researched the journals, the HBC journals of Francois Lucier. Him and his son were very well-known horsemen in the area. And he noted and he writes, and it was very secretive how it was written, but he notes when they moved the horses, and they moved them 4 miles due south along the river or along the lake. Horses were very sought after at the time. That was the way everybody got around, obviously. And so both legally and illegally. And they did not want that kind of energy around the fort, so the horses were kept in a separate area. The Métis also played a vital role as liaisons, and in many cases, they knew the land, the people, the languages. It was not uncommon for people to speak 2 to 3 languages, including the trade language. So let me get started with a few things. I'll just go through a few symbols and share a little bit of history about those. The infinity symbol referring to the joining of 2 cultures that will go on forever and ever, the European and the First Nations. The red background symbolizing the connection and the work for the Hudson Bay Company, and the blue stood for the Northwest Fur Trade Company. This flag is noted as being the first independently flown flag in Canada, and was first recorded as being seen at the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, and was considered a symbol of the new emerging Métis nationalism in Manitoba. From there it grew and followed the Métis West, and is still considered and used today as to symbolize Métis identity. It is recorded that when the Métis went anywhere, they would fly their flags. Even on buffalo hunts, you would see them flying their flags. There are over 100 different recorded flags from the Métis of the Western Plains. They even created a battle standard for the resistance, the Riel resistance. And I don't call it a rebellion. I was always taught that they weren't a bunch of rebellious teenagers. They were resisting what the government was trying to impose on them with their land. The flag bore a hand, as you can see, a wolf's head, and 2 scrolls proclaiming Maison, Hôtel, and Surtout de Liberté. Homes, altars, above all freedom. And excuse my French if anybody out there speaks French. The suggested prayer says, we lift our hand in prayer to the Creator that He grant us the courage of the wolf to defend our homes, freedom for all. To me, that says so much about Métis pride and identity. The Red River Cart. And when I was doing this today, I was thinking the person that showed me this was Terry Lusty. In the trade language, there was a sign for the Red River Cart. Half man, half cart, half man. Half cart, half man. The cart is designed after a Scottish Highlands cart, and it's made entirely of wood with no nails. You could take the wheels off and float it across the river. You could use it as a sleigh in the winter if needed. These carts were used by everyone who was traveling the prairies before the train came west. The Red River Cart was used for freighting goods to western regions, and when traveling in large groups, they were known as brigades. One of the well-known Métis freighters of the region in the 1880s was Octave Belrose. That was his primary job through the winter months. On March 28, 1881, which would be just a few days from now if we were in 1881, the Edmonton Bulletin reports that Octave started a train to Victoria. It was probably Victoria's settlement, which is just down by Smoky Lake. And he started to the train to Victoria on Monday with 5,900 pounds of flour for the Indian department. On October of that same year, he is reported as having returned with 11 carts for Villiers and Pearsons, who were Edmonton merchants, marking 97 cartloads of freight received by the firm in that season. The report did not say where he came from, but it's guessed that he was coming from Saskatchewan because that was the end of the railway line at that time. When the Métis traveled with the cart, they would haul their goods within it, and they would either walk or ride a horse alongside of it. When you take your oxen off, it will tilt its way down and made for a convenient camping space underneath. When they went into the buffalo hunts, they would literally circle the wagons, but I'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the buffalo hunts. Bannock, my favorite. In the Michif language, which is the language of the Métis, it's known as la galette. It's like a small cake. That's kind of what it translates into. Nowadays, there are many different ways to make bannock. You see it all over the place. Everybody has their own take on bannock, which is a good thing. But when first introduced to Canada, it comes from Scotland. It comes from our Scottish ancestors. I always remember watching Braveheart when they had the Battle of Bannockburn, and I was just like, oh, there it is, that's right there. It was initially made over a fire, either on a stick or in a cast iron pan. At our house, we never, ever fried bannock. That was always reserved for when my mom made fresh bread dough, and we had the little bread ends, and she would fry them in the cast iron frying pan for us. My mom always baked it. She would sometimes put raisins in it or cheese, and she'd like to cut it into little biscuits, and they were always so puffy and light. Even all the traditional women that I had the honor of learning from in my youth baked it in an oven or cooked it over an open fire. I never had fried bannock until I came to Edmonton. And really, I thought, wow, what have I been missing? They're like little donuts. They were so good. And the first time I tried it, it was at the old Friendship Center that was down just off Jasper and 117th. And if I remember correctly, and somebody might in this room know, but I think the woman's name was Madeline. She was the cook there. And that was the first time I tried that bannock, and it was just so good. The biggest compliment that I ever got and received was from my husband when he told me that I started to make bannock like the old ladies, and I always strive to be like those old ladies because they're just so precious. The fiddle music and celebration. What can I say about fiddle music? It's like the Métis. When you hear it, you can hear folk music from all of our founding peoples. And when you see the dance, it's the same, but is uniquely Canadian and uniquely Métis. There is a third beat, and it's hard to copy. And I've heard people who are trying to learn how to do fiddling like the Métis, and even if they're very skilled fiddlers, they have a hard time getting that third beat in there. You also hear that third beat in the jig. Especially if they're jigging in moccasins, you hear a third beat. And I was always told that that's the drum beat. They're bringing that drum beat into it. The Métis always had music with them. Even as a kid, we always had music going, or there was somebody there. My brother played guitar, always had something going like that. The fiddle was easy to carry. It was small. They also learned to make their own fiddles, and that was another trait that came from that was brought over by their fathers and grandfathers. Métis fiddle music is considered the first folk music of the West, along with the jigs that were created alongside them. The Métis loved to celebrate and would throw huge community parties. And again, the historical Métis tradition dictates that before a new house had been occupied for more than 2 days, that the owner had to invite the neighbors to a big dance. So again, in the Edmonton Bulletin, the records show that in August of 1884, our Octave Belrose had just finished his new house on his farm on River Lot 38 at Big Lake Settlement. The event was celebrated by a ball, they said, in the evening, in which people traveled for more than 9 miles on foot, where they danced reels, jigs, and other old-time dances. There would be no furniture in the house. There would be a stump in the corner or a chair in the corner for the fiddle player. So when they wanted to rest, they were either on the floor or they would go outside and rest underneath the Red River carts. By the end of the life of that house, we have it recorded that it was being used as a barn, and it had a very good hayloft because that house had a second story. Christmas was celebrated as well, but was more reserved. Strong Catholic ties. You would always go to Mass, and usually midnight Mass, and then you would go visiting afterwards. One of the things that the Métis did was they didn't go to people's house and expect everybody to feed them. They brought food with them and would feed the people that they were visiting as well. There were no gifts exchanged, as it was important to give thanks and to keep strong family connections in the community. Weddings were another story. Weddings could go on for several days. And of course, upon returning from buffalo hunts and having been away from home for sometimes many months, a huge celebration would ensue. Everybody participated. It wasn't just the men and the women. The children were celebrating because everybody worked. Everybody had a part in what they were doing. Every family member had a role. And so everybody got to celebrate because they all worked really hard. The Meaty Sash. Now, when I first started talking and I talked about that prayer that was written by Father Guy Lavallee, I'm going to read you a little excerpt of that prayer. I'm not going to read the whole 20 minutes, but just a little excerpt of that prayer. This prayer I use when I'm teaching kids about finger weaving and about collective rights. This is part of a program that I use, and it's just a really good way of explaining. So he wrote, he said, Métis people, God, have been wearing the sash proudly for many years. When I look at it, I notice it is composed of many interconnected threads, many strands, many patterns, many colors contribute to the overall design of the sash. Our Métis culture, God, is like the sash. The lives of the Métis have been woven together from a variety of cultures, traditions, and beliefs. For example, God, we are descendants of the English, of the French, of the Cree and Ojibwe and Scots, to name a few. We speak a variety of languages: French, Canadian French, English, Michif, French Michif, Michif Cree, and Muskegon. Look at the sash. It is a composite. It is a mixture. It is Métis. It is made of a variety of elements like the lives of the Métis. Look at the pattern, its fabric, and its colors. Nonetheless, these different elements form an integrated whole. Similarly, the different ethnic backgrounds and different languages of the Métis blend into one another to form a rich tapestry like the lives of the Métis culture. The Métis sash is something that we have in common with the French Canadians, but there again, you know, the Métis take it and put their own little spin on it, just like we have with Bannock and just like we have with the Red River Cart. It was initially used as a tool belt for the voyageurs and the coureurs de bois. When you signed a contract with the Hudson Bay Company, it was usually a 3-year contract. You were required to carry heavy amounts of weight. You were guaranteed 3 to 5 pipe breaks. You were guaranteed a dram of rum every night, and you were guaranteed a bowl of porridge every morning. And so when they made these sashes, the women finger wove them. These are 2 examples of finger woven sashes. But when they made their sashes were anywhere from 6 to 10 feet long and about 12 inches wide. And there was no loom. You take the threads, you have it in between 2 pieces of dowel. We use dowel. I actually use chopsticks because they have a good grip on them. And you are the weaver. Your hands are the weaver. So the woman that I work with makes sashes. She doesn't make them that big. And the most amount of threads she's worked on has been, I think she said 285. But we were trying to figure out if you had made a sash that big, you would have over 300 threads that you were manipulating with your own fingers and creating these very unique patterns. The young girls would sit at the bottom, and they would help their mothers untangle the back weave. And that was how they learned those patterns, was by untangling the back weave. So when you tied that sash tightly around your waist, You didn't have something hanging out like you see now, because that would have been a hazard for them. It was cinched really tight around here. All of that kept all of that energy up on top. So when you're portaging and carrying those weights, you have that heat up on top. It also protected your kidneys from popping out. We have read records where they have found bodies from guys that have been voyageurs, where they have a curved spine because they bent over all the time. Sometimes the sash could be used as a tump line, so you have it on your head and it's supporting the weight on your back. Those bodies that have been found actually have an indent in their skull from the years of carrying the weight on their body like that. It could be, it was a pocket, so they kept their tobacco in there, but if they were carrying papers, they also had the papers there. But it was also a sling if you broke your arm. It was a horse blanket. You could take a thread out and you could sew your pants up with it. You could haul wood with it. You could do all kinds of things with the sash. The colors don't really have too much meaning from what I've been told. The sash that I'm wearing now was gifted to me by my friend Bunny, who is a weaver on a loom. She works on a loom. And this is something that you will see in Manitoba, but Manitoba is the only province that I know that really has their own colors. The colors mean different things to different people. And one of the old Métis guys shared with me what he thought the colors were. And they're very much like the First Nations definition of what the colors are. So yellow is for the sun, blue is for the sky or the water, green is for Mother Earth. Red could be for the blood that runs through our body, the fire that keeps us warm. And he says the white is for the spirit of the Métis, because we're very spirited, and he says our blood is pure. That was from old George Goulet, who is an author. One thing that I had drilled into me as I was a kid was that women never wore the sash around their waist. We have our First Nations teachings, and we create life, and we're very powerful because we create life, so we don't bind our waist. We want to be connected with the earth. So that's why I wear my sash like this tonight. This sash in particular, though, has been my scarf on several occasions. I'm so proud to have this scarf, or this sash from Bunny, so I try to wear it as much as I can. The buffalo. Pasqua mustus. My favorite word in Michif is for the buffalo, la buffalo. I think that's so awesome. It is estimated at the time of first contact that there was anywhere from 40 to 100 million head of buffalo on the plains of North America, reaching from northern Canada all the way down to the southern United States. The buffalo were the general store of the plains. You got everything from the buffalo: food, clothing, housing, tools, jewelry, everything else that you needed, even a teether for your baby. Do you want to know what they used for the teether? The nose. They would take the nose off, and they would clean it, and they would cook it, and when you boil it, it becomes almost like the consistency of an eraser. And so they would give it to the babies to chew on so that they could teeth. I've had moose nose soup and that, but I've never tried to eat buffalo, and I'm glad I never did. The Métis had a spectacular way of hunting the buffalo, and it was militarized, and it had laws. The first law of the hunt: no hunting on a Sabbath day. There were two major hunts every year: the summer hunt and the winter hunt, known as the Hivernot Rendezvous. So let me set the scene, but I need a drink first. Thank you for being patient. So what would happen is the communities would get together, Lac St. Anne, St. Albert, Calahoo, Onaway, all of those regions, people living in the Fort Saskatchewan area and they would have a meeting. And at that meeting, they would decide when the hunt would happen, and they would elect their general. You always had an elected general, you had captains, you had scouts. Everybody, like I said, had a role. So the gentleman that I like to focus on is Sam Cunningham. And I just found out that somebody here by the name of Cody is related. Sam is an interesting guy, and there's lots of information about him. He was a real well-known mover and shaker, educated man, politician, but was a really skilled buffalo hunter. He was elected official of the Northwest Council at the time. Sam had been going on buffalo hunts all of his life. He was also they also decided which community would be the scouts, who would be in charge of setting up the camp, who would stand guard. On the decided day, they would all gather and head south toward the Red Deer region. The Métis of St. Albert would go, and they would go on very large hunts, and they would be taken away from their homes for months. When they hunted, they would gather people from all over, like I said. The summer hunts could include more than 300 Red River carts, and whole families would travel along with their dogs to where they were going. Usually when they were traveling and heading to down south, where they would cross the river in Edmonton would be right around where the high-level bridge is. There was a good incline and a good way to get down there. But the interesting thing about the Métis is if you had 300 carts, you weren't all crossing or able to cross in one day. The ones that were on the other side of the river never left until the other ones were there. They always waited till everybody was together. They would travel along with their dogs to where the buffalo grazed on the summer grasses. The encampment would be set up in a circle, like I said, with the Red River carts to protect the people. And in some cases, they would bring the horses inside the circle if they thought that there was a threat. At that time, threat could be the prairie bears, it could be the wolves, it could be just, other people wanting to come and steal horses. And they always had their priests, and every night the priests would hold mass and bless the hunters before they engaged in this awesome spectacle. The hunt really resembled a military action, and the general was the commander. There were designated squadrons that were assigned different duties, like protecting the camp and all of that stuff, like I said. The hunt was like nothing ever witnessed on the Great Plains. One of the notable women in that area that participated in the buffalo hunt was Victoria Calahoo. Her mother was a medicine woman, a Muskegee Esqueo. Ruben will probably correct me. And she assisted her mother on many, many hunts. One of the quotes we have, we did oral history with Victoria in 1960, I think it was. And she says, I always used to accompany my mother on these trips. She was the medicine woman who set broken bones and knew how to use the medicinal herbs. The riders who chased the buffalo were often thrown, sometimes by the bull charging the rider's horse or by the horse getting their feet into badger holes. So I'm going to tell you how that hunt happened. Once the scouts came back and notified the hunters where the herd was grazing, they would set out very quietly. You did not want to get the buffalo running before they got there. They would get into position. One of the other laws of the hunt was that you could not get your horse running before the general gave his command. The reason being that if you got all those buffalo running, you could lose the herd, but also people could get hurt. Once the general gave his signal, the riders would start to run their horses, and they would be on either side of the herd. So herds at that time were rather big. So let's say we got a herd of about 300 animals. So you can imagine 300 buffalo running, the ground is shaking, literally shaking. There's dust everywhere, there's noise. It's really kind of chaotic. And these guys are having to hunt their buffalo. They're also using muskets. So all of their, the gunpowder is on their side in their powder horn, which was probably a buffalo horn. Their musket was in their hand. They were steering their horses with their legs to make sure that they stayed on. And they kept all the lead balls in their mouth. I think about, when I say that to kids, they all go, ew, like, what about the poison? And I just think, what about when they fall? Did they choke on those things? Like, it was very dangerous. And they would have to load their guns as they're riding the horses at full speed. So there they are trying to get the gunpowder in. They're spitting that ball into the gun. They're pounding it down on their leg or on the the horn of the saddle to make sure that that lead ball goes all the way down to the base, because if it doesn't, it can backfire on you. They're able to raise their rifle, sight their animal, and shoot their animal. I've read more about people falling off their horses or getting bucked off their horses or being charged by buffalo than I've heard of them being accidentally shot by somebody on the other side. These guys were marksmen. They knew what they were doing. Usually a quota for a hunt like that was usually 3 to 4 buffalo. You weren't just hunting for yourself, you were hunting to support the community, but you were also hunting to support your trade with the fort. After the hunt had finished and all the other herd had left the area, that's when the women and children came in. And the whole site became a whole big site for processing the meat. You couldn't take raw meat back with you. You couldn't take raw hides back with you. You couldn't take bones back with you that hadn't been boiled and cured. So everything was done on the site. So, you know, they were gone for sometimes several months. They would have all of that completed. They would head back to their respective communities, all stopping in Fort Edmonton to sell their goods. The Métis of this area were very well known for their pemmican. And there's oral talk, but we've not found any writings about having an actual pemmican factory in the St. Albert area along the Sturgeon River. But they were very well known for their pemmican. And the Métis realized that it could be used as a commodity, and they were entrepreneurs. Now you have to think about that, about them having horses and guns, because not too long before that, before there was contact out here, we didn't have the horses that we have now. There wasn't even a lot of horses. A lot of horses came up through the south from the Spanish. They didn't have guns. So that's when you have them using the buffalo jumps and running alongside with the wolf skins on them and everything like that, which was even more dangerous than how the Métis did it. It really was, you know, something to be seen, I think. I think it would have been just a great, epic kind of battle to be seen, watching these men running these buffalo and doing what they had to do to support their families. I'll get into a little bit about land use. In 1885, we're kind of familiar with that date. There was a lot going on in Canada with the Métis and getting people onto reserves and discovering how much land was being, they were gaining in Canada, and also trying to assimilate Métis people. The Métis in St. Albert were very progressive. They had long-standing houses there. They were businessmen. They were educated. Their kids were, you know, going to school there, all of that stuff. But the Edmonton Bulletin and the Winnipeg Free Press started writing articles about the Métis. They were calling them savages. They were accusing them of holding secret meetings. They were saying that they might uprise. What are we going to do? The Métis are going to turn on us, and we live next door to them, and all of that stuff. And in response, the Métis decided that they needed to write a letter back. And that was Sam Cunningham and the community, the men in the community there. And they wrote back and they said that they had no intention of uprising, that they had a long-standing commitment to the area, and this was their community too. They had businesses, farms, well-established river lots, and they had an inherent right to that land, not only from their First Nations ancestry, but also from what the Bible had been teaching them and how they must use the land to help their family. How could the population misjudge them, they thought? As this was going on, the Script Commission was coming through, and the Script Commission was set up to identify the Métis, or if your ancestors were from Scotland or England, you were known as half-breeds. You were given a parcel of land, that's what Script was, or a sum of money. And the Métis had been living on their river lots, just like the ones in Batoche, for over 70 years. So you can see the Métis had the long, nice river lots. The government of Canada was bringing in the quarter share. So you could see how it was cutting up the river lots. The Métis were like, hold on, we've been living like this for, 2 and 3 generations. How can you come in and just take our land and just cut it up like that? Plus we won't have access to the water, and we all need to have access to that water. And the government was like, nope, this is what's happening. We're doing this. And so the Métis decided to write a letter to the Canadian government. They wrote a letter, they signed a petition, they sent it to Ottawa with Father Leduc, Dan Maloney, who's one of the Irish immigrants that came in that was really part of the community as well. You can go into the archives of the Canadian House of Commons and you can read that letter, or you can read them debating about the letter from Bishop Grandin and the Métis of St. Albert. And for some reason, they were allowed to keep their original 56 river lots. So when I was going to school, we didn't get a lot of Canadian content when I was in school, very, very little. But I knew about Louis Riel through my family and my mom, and he was our hero. And I go to school and I'm told that he's a traitor. He was a traitor to Canada and he was hung for treason. And I went home and said, this is what they're saying about Louis Riel. And my mom said, this is what I'll tell you. She said, there was a genuine dislike between Louis Riel and John A. Macdonald. One gentleman was English, the other was French. One gentleman belonged to the Orange Order, the other one was Métis. One was Catholic, one wasn't. When I heard this story, I had learnt that the Métis of Batoche had sent 87 letters, and 87 times they were denied by the Canadian government to keep their river lots. And they sent the government there to fight those people to get their land from them. Not in St. Albert. They kept their original 56 river lots. Something else that happened at that time was, with all of that stuff being written, there was also Big Bear and his group from Northern Alberta who had not gone on to treaty land yet and were wandering around looking for a place to settle. They were hungry and had been on the road for a long, long time. People were starving. And they ended up in Frog Lake. And it wasn't so much Big Bear that I've read, it was more his son and some of the younger guys. And they went in and they started wreaking havoc at Frog Lake. And there was hostages taken, and there was actually 2 priests that were killed. The Métis in St. Albert got wind of that. And that really bothered them. How can you kill men of the cloth? But also at the time, you have to think, you have to know that there was an unease in the area and people were scared. They thought that Big Bear was going to come to this area and was going to do what he had done in Frog Lake. And they were genuinely scared. They didn't go to Fort Edmonton to be protected. They were all on Mission Hill in St. Albert. That's where they went. And so the St. Albert people organized and developed what is known as the St. Albert Mounted Rifles, the first recognized Canadian militia. And they were put together to protect the community in case Big Bear or any of that was coming this way. So they actually got on their horses and they headed out, and they got as far as Lacombe. And you have to consider time of travel, and things were slower back then and everything. By the time they got to Lacombe, the things had settled down and arrests had been made and everything like that. So they came back to St. Albert and were disbanded as a militia. But that's a story that you don't hear about. You don't hear that in the history books. But it's a very unique story to this area. We have the roster in the museum, the Musée Héritage where I work, with all the names. And you have names like Cunningham, Belrose, Vandals, Paget, all of these really old Métis names that have been in that area for so long. As time went on and more immigrants started moving to the west, the Métis started to feel the pinch. St. Albert had been established as a village in 1861, but the Métis people had been living along that area, along that river, way long before that. By the late 1880s, the population was 1,000. Most of the residents were Métis. If you look there, you can see Batoche, and that's the one we know, that's the one we're taught more about, that's the one that's more in the curriculum and that. But look at the difference in population. St. Albert was a bigger community and stayed a bigger community. Their numbers stayed pretty consistent with the exception of when the smallpox came through. So there was a priest in the area, his name was Father Emile Tardif, and he did census of people, and he did stats around what was going on in the town and everything like that. And he did his census through ethnicity. So you can see, you know, he would write, there was, you know, like 84 French and 2 German and that kind of stuff. So he writes that there are 340 people, 340 Métis people in St. Albert. And by, in 1900, that was the number that he gave in 1900. By 1930, there's only one Métis person identifying. So what happened? What happened to those people? They were losing their community to newcomers. Many Métis people quit identifying. They went with their French ancestry or their Scottish ancestry. Many left. A lot of those names that I said, Belrose, Cunningham, those kind of names are up north. And those are all direct links to the ancestors that they had in this area here. This is a time in the region that was not good for the Métis. They were becoming the forgotten people. Many had become squatters. They lost their jobs as freighters due to the railway. They lost their status in the community. They were robbed of the scrip in many cases, and many lost their homes. It was a really sad time. In 1895, Father Lacombe, who was he's an interesting man, you know. When I first started working and at the museum, one of the things that I had to do was interpret Catholic history. And I had a bit of a block there. I'd heard stories, you know, we all hear stories. We have people that have been in the schools, you know, and all of that stuff. So I had a hard time with that. I wasn't too sure how I was going to explain it because I had my own bias. But as I started to read about this gentleman and the work that he did, he was a rather interesting man for his time. He had respect from the First Nations. The Blackfoot called him the man with the noble soul, and the Cree referred to him as the man with the good heart. He could speak those languages. St. Albert is named after his patron saint, but when you read his journals, he's there for, you know, 4 or 5 years, and then he starts to write, oh, I got to get out of this community. There's too many people. I want to be out on the land. He was a real adventurer. And when you look at him, he looks like a kind of like a movie star kind of guy, you know. He had quite the following. My great-grandfather, or great-grandmother, was quite endeared with him and followed him through his journeys down into southern Alberta. But he also recognized that that times were changing for the Métis, and that there was going to be big change in their life, and he was concerned for them. There was the depletion of the buffalo herds, the newcomers. All of these factors were going to change the Métis identity and change it forever. So he went north, close to Saddle Lake, and set up another mission known as St. Paul de Métis. My great-grandmother, Julia Boucher, followed him there. But there again, by the early 1900s, more and more people are moving west, more and more newcomers are coming in, and the Métis are being pushed out. We've always been really political, right from the get-go, politics. I always say politics are in our genes. Can't get away from it. I try to because I lived it with my mother and watched her go through it, and I don't have as tough a skin as she does, but still, you got to have that political blood in you as a Métis person, I think. So there were two Métis associations that were set up at different times. The first one was known as the Half-Breed Association in Northwest, and that was set up in about 1895. And it was, the first meeting was held in the church at St. Albert. In 1932, they organized again, and there again, that meeting happened in the church in St. Albert in the basement. And that was the beginning of the Métis Association of Alberta. The Métis knew that if they wanted to help their people, that they had to get political, and they had to unite. It was also a time too when you started to hear more and more people referring to themselves as the Métis, not so much as the half-breed anymore. Because like I said, I'm not half anything. I'm 100% Métis, and that's how I've been raised. It was a time of the Great Depression, so most Canadians were feeling the effects. Everybody was struggling. It was when my mother was born in 1929, right in the midst of the Depression. And everybody was feeling the effects, but in particular the Métis. A lot of them were living in road allowance, and that's basically in the ditch. They did not have reserve land, they did not have river lots, and they did not have their scrip. That's when the Métis, the new Métis Association of Alberta sent a group of men from different regions to provide and start negotiations with the Alberta government to gain some sort of assistance for the Métis people. There's Father Lacombe in the middle. Father Leduc. And I put Father Moulin in there because Father Moulin was the priest at Batoche, and he was a confidant of Louis Riel. And these men, you know, and we have our thoughts about priests and that, but these early men that were out here were really, a lot of them had the best interest of people. That didn't always last. It didn't last. But these, especially Moulin and Lacombe, they really wanted the people to survive and wanted to support them and recognize their identity and wanted them to have that. I know in our family during that time, like I said, Julia Boucher, who was my great-grandmother, was from St. Albert. And she was taken into the residential school as a young girl from the gun area. She was a First Nations woman when she went in there. She was a treaty Indian, as they called her. And they actually took her treaty rights away from her. And in the papers, you read in there where they say that she ceases to be an Indian. On this day, she ceases to be an Indian, and she becomes a Métis. And they actually paid her out some money for being an Indian for the many days that she was. And then she was given scrip, and that scrip was given to the nuns. She married my great-grandfather, Sever Villeneuve, who had had another wife before her. He was a bit of a rouser, from what I gather, and had 2 children with him. We had a small family, my grandfather and my great-uncle. My great-uncle, although he wasn't diagnosed, as we learn about him more and more, we think that he was probably autistic. Very sweet gentleman. I remember meeting him. My grandfather died before I was born. But Julia had her kids. And when Father Lacombe went to St. Paul de Métis, she went with them and left Sever. Sever had gone up north anyway. He had left her pretty much in St. Albert. So she followed Lacombe. And then when Lacombe went down to Calgary and to Midnapore, she went down to Calgary and to Midnapore and stayed there. And that's how my family and my mom's siblings ended up being all born in Calgary. My grandfather, Paul, worked for Pat Burns on the ranches. And that's where he met my grandmother, who was this Danish woman who had been abandoned by her stepmother. Her dad had died. She left my grandmother and her siblings in Calgary. And so they met and they created this really unique little family that are now my family. They lived in the middle of Calgary, and my grandmother had a huge garden, huge garden. She would quart or can everything that she had. And my mom has really fond memories of the First Nations people coming and trading with her. And if they had meat or wild game that they weren't always allowed to have, they would trade with my grandmother for her vegetables and fruits. So it was always an ongoing kind of thing. Many aunties and uncles who weren't really aunties and uncles, but were aunties and uncles, were part of that. They had a little house that was by their place, and that was for old people. One of the old grannies lived in there, but there was also an old blind man that lived in there that my mom helped look after. So our families are always, we got lots of extended family, and we have lots of jobs, and we care for everybody. That's how I was raised. That's the old way of doing things. Children serve. So the Métis Betterment Act was enacted by the province of Alberta in 1938. And it was a joint Métis and government committee that identified the lands for the Métis settlements. Alberta Métis are the only land-based Métis. And they're not reserves or anything like that. It was land that they negotiated with the province. That initially there were 12 Métis settlements set aside. The settlements, and you might know these names, Peavine, Caslin, Coal Lake, East Prairie, Elizabeth Settlement, Fishing Lake, Gift Lake, Kikino, Paddle Prairie, Touchwood, Marlborough, and Wolf Lake. Those were the 12 that were set up. There was an initial vision that the Métis and the Minister for the Crown would work together to form programs that would better the lives of the settlement Métis. Hunting and trapping rights on settlement lands could be enacted by the Lieutenant Governor in Council. So to me, when I read that, that means that they were actually negotiating with the Crown. They weren't negotiating so much, because the Lieutenant Governor is the representative of the Queen. There was also a framework for the creation of settlement associations that had the authority to establish criteria and conditions for settlement membership, constitutions, election, board meetings, and other issues pertaining to the management of settlements. So almost like their own little municipality. Instead of a mayor, you had, the leader of the council or whatever. But in 1940, the government threw in some changes there, significant changes to the act that increased the government bureaucracy and control, in which in effect reduced the Métis decision-making and involvement. Namely, the province retained the right to set conditions for occupation, land development, use of the settlements, resources, and such as timber and mineral rights. During the 1940s, the settlement Métis received financial relief in return for building roads, cutting timber, preparing sites, and constructing their homes and schools. Besides farming, Métis settlements in the Peace River area also benefited from job opportunities in commercial fishing and with construction of new provincial highways that were being built in the area. Some of the lands were rescinded. Now, when I read this, they said that the Métis didn't want to live there, but that's not what I've been told or heard. They were taken away from them. They said that the land was not viable, that the communities were not viable, but the people that I talked to were living pretty good lives there. So, sorry, I just lost my place. There we go. Touchwood was rescinded in 1940, followed by Marlborough in 1941. Marlborough still kind of stands as a community. It's just outside of Edson. We used to go there as a kid. My mom knew people there and we would stop there. It didn't retain its settlement status, but it still is a very strong Métis community. Many of the residents moved to Paddle Prairie, which is in northern Alberta, and changed their occupation to agriculture. There's really good soil up there. There's a huge Mennonite colony up there, and they moved up there because the growing is so good. Small, short growing spurt, but really good soil. Another thing with the Métis up there, and in most of them, were their horses. Chuck wagon races and so forth. The Ridsdales out of there and that, which are my husband's people, were very well known chuck wagon racers from the area. With the declining population and the Canadian government building an army base, Cold Lake was rescinded in 1956. So we know Cold Lake now is a very vibrant community. They said that it wasn't a good community for the Métis to live in. But right after that, in 1960, they started to build that base that they have out there right now. It was later followed by Wolf Lake. 4 years later, so 1962. Many former residents of the Wolf Lake settlement relocated to other settlements, just as the other ones had. And by 1960, there were 8 Métis settlements that would remain. Those are the ones you see up there now. You have settlements like Buffalo Lake, East Prairie, Elizabeth Settlement, Fishing Lake, Gift Lake, Kikino, Paddle Prairie, and Peavine. A lot of these settlements were around the area that I grew up. I grew up in Slave Lake. I remember playing a lot of ball with these people. Great baseball players. Those Cunninghams were really good at ball. But just all of those things that have been imparted on me and shared with me that I share with you now and the likes of you. So I want to thank you for sitting and listening to me. If you have any questions, I'd be more willing to ask questions. But it's just been a real honor to sit here in front of Terry and Ed and men that I hold in high esteem for their knowledge and share what I know and have learned from them. So thank you very much.